Hello, everyone. Welcome to another PNP Live. My name is Bashan. I am part of the event staff with Politics and Prose. Before we get started with today's event, just have a couple quick things to go over. The first is that at any point during this event, if you would like to ask a question of our guests, we would ask for you to place it in the Q&A box, which can be found towards the bottom of your screen. Again, if you put your questions in there, that would help us keep everything organized and help to facilitate the question and answer period. Also, at any point during the event, you'll be able to go to the chat section where you'll be able to find a link which will take you directly to the Politics and Prose website where you can purchase a copy of America on Fire. Of course, we highly encourage you to do so, and we thank you for your continued patronage as that continues to help us bring you these events. What began in spring 2020 as local protests in response to the killing of George Floyd by Minneapolis police quickly exploded into a massive nationwide movement. Millions of mostly young people defiantly flooded into the nation's streets, demanding an end to police brutality and to the broader systemic oppression of Black people. To many observers, the protests appeared to be without precedent in their scale and persistence. Yet, as the acclaimed historian Elizabeth Hinton demonstrates in America on Fire, the events of 2020 had clear precursors, and any attempt to understand our current crisis requires a reckoning with the recent past. This recent iteration of Black rebellion, as America on Fire powerfully illustrates, was born in response to poverty and exclusion, but most immediately in reaction to police violence. In 1968, President Lyndon Johnson launched the War on Crime, sending militarized police forces into impoverished Black neighborhoods. Facing increasing surveillance and brutality, residents began to throw rocks, Molotov cocktails at officers, plundered local businesses, and even vandalized exploitative institutions. Ms. Hinton draws on exclusive sources to uncover a previously hidden geography of violence in smaller American cities, from York, Pennsylvania, to Cairo, Illinois, to Stockton, California. Elizabeth Hinton is an associate professor of history and African American studies at Yale University, and she's also a professor of law at Yale Law School. She is also the author of From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime. Ms. Hinton will be in conversation today with Nikole Hannah-Jones, an award-winning investigative reporter who covers civil rights and racial injustice for the New York Times Magazine. She also serves as the Knight Chair of Race and Investigative Reporting at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and a co-founder of the Ida B. Wells Society. Forthcoming will be the 1619 Project, The New Origin Story, an elaboration on the original 1619 Project in the New York Times, and it will hit bookshelves this November. Without any further ado, Ms. Hannah-Jones, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and
muted,
thank
Nikole.
you. Oh, I unmuted. No, you can't
No,
hear
you're
me?
good. You're good now. You're good now.
Oh, it's like, I know I pushed that unmute button. I was determined not to do what everybody does at least one time on these Zoom talks. So I just wanted to say thank you, Politics and Prose, for hosting this conversation. And just so excited to be in conversation with you, Dr. Hinton. If you look at my book, it's completely dog-eared, and every page has underlines on it. It's such just a fascinating and important study, and just so necessary in these times. So I wondered if, just to begin, the book, of course, is called America on Fire, The Untold History of Police Violence and Black Rebellion Since 1960s. I almost said since 1619.
Well,
so
there is. Go ahead.
ahead.
I was gonna say, I know in the 1619 book that's coming out in November, Michelle and Leslie Alexander actually take this story back to 1619. So it could, it could be that book could
Absolutely. So I wonder, just for the audience, just describe this book. What is the thesis of the book, and after that, then tell us how you became interested in the subject and decided to write a book on it.
So the book traces the history of Black rebellion from the kind of what I call the crucible era of the late 60s and early 70s through the present. And in doing so, draws our attention to the cycle, which we're still very much stuck in, of police violence and community violence. One of the central findings of the book is that far from actually effectively controlling crime or preventing violence and social harm, police violence precipitates community violence. The immediate response on the part of Black Americans living in the communities that were targeted by the early programs of the war on crime in the 1960s was to fight back. And we see this cycle unfolding in its various forms through the remainder of the 20th century, and then of course into our own time. And last summer, we again witnessed, the streets of American cities resembled to many like what we witnessed in the 1960s, emerging mass protest movement. What we saw last summer, some have called the largest mass mobilization in US history. In fact, that was defined by both, last summer was the vast majority of protests were peaceful, but by both nonviolent and violent protests for racial justice, catalyzed by incidents of police brutality. And the extreme violence of the 1960s has haunted the United States ever since. This work came both, as was mentioned earlier, my first book traced the history of federal crime control policy from the Kennedy administration through the Reagan administration to really look at the ways in which the targeted crime control programs that federal policymakers began to embrace at the height of the civil rights movement and progressive social change in the war on poverty fostered the mass criminalization of low-income Americans of color in the communities that they targeted. And over the course of doing that research, I had mostly consulted White House central files of the presidential administrations I engaged with, but I began to notice that, the period that we typically thought of as being kind of the peak years of urban disorder, that is like really what's known as the long hot summer in '67 with Detroit and Newark, and then the 100-some cities that erupted in response to Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination in April 1968, I began to notice that rebellion persisted well into the 1970s and beyond. And so, this became a question that I couldn't quite capture in that history of federal policy. How are residents actually responding to the expansion of American police forces and the militarization of police in their communities as those strategies hit the ground, beginning really in the late 60s and into the 1970s?
So I have so many questions, and I'm trying to make sure I put them in an order that makes sense for the conversation. So let's start just with terminology. Of course, we have been taught to call these riots, and you are clearly calling them rebellions. And of course, that terminology, we know that language really determines how we think about something. So talk about the use of those two terms, and what does the word riots evoke when we think about Black people uprisings versus rebellions?
That's such an important question. And let me first say that, my choice to use the word rebellion also, comes from the ways in which the people who participated in these acts of political violence understood their own actions. So for instance, in my home state of Michigan, the Detroit uprising of '67 is not known by the people who participated in it as a Detroit riot. That's what other people call it. It's still called the Great Rebellion. Residents saw themselves as rebellion. They did not see themselves as rioting. And I think, first and foremost, it's really important to, especially in trying to privilege the groups of people who embrace this form of political protest, to privilege the ways in which they understood themselves and their own actions, and not the ideas that other people imposed on them. And so the use of the term riot is part of what has kind of kept us in this cycle that I described earlier. When Harlem was the first city to really explode on the national stage in the summer of 1964, and residents erupted in response to the killing of a 15-year-old high school student by a New York City police officer. And even though, you know, the kind of root causes of the rebellion, the socioeconomic drivers that compelled people to break the, you know, throw rocks at the windows of stores and burn buildings and fight back against police who were brutalizing them, were rooted in the same grievances as mainstream civil rights organizations. That is a desire and a demand for decent jobs, access to expanded and robust educational opportunities, adequate housing, and basically full political and economic inclusion in American society. Johnson and other officials from jump said, distinguish this political violence from civil rights, said, you know, this riot in Harlem has nothing to do with civil rights. It is criminal. It is tied to juvenile delinquency. It's meaningless. And in labeling it and seeing it as a riot and kind of divorcing it from its political motivations, then and seeing it as something, labeling it as something that's criminal, then the only response to that criminal action, right, is the police. It's not the demands that people want. It's not the drivers that are bringing them to the streets and protests in the first place. And so if riots are criminal and the only solution is police, then again, we're caught in this cycle that the response on the part of policymakers is to continue to escalate the deployment of the very thing that is precipitating the political violence in the first place, and that is, of course, law enforcement.
So take me through this kind of language shift and how that happens with President Johnson, because of course, President Johnson helps get the major civil rights legislation passed through Congress. And as you know, Black people are seeing the largest expansion and securing of their rights since Reconstruction, we're also seeing rebellions happening all across the country, and particularly outside of the kind of apartheid South, where these laws are taking effect. And Johnson, of course, is very perplexed by this. Black people are getting all of these rights, and yet they're rioting, quote unquote, all across these urban, northern, and western areas. So how does the architect of the Great Society, who believes that we need to have a war on poverty, who is helping push through civil rights legislation, begin to say, we're not accepting? Why does he begin to see this shift? And is it because he thinks he will lose political support, or does he actually believe that this violence is not political violence?
Well, I think one, it's a combination of both. I mean, it's such an important question that lays the backdrop for many of the dynamics I'm describing in this book, but that really goes to the heart of a lot of what I take up in the first book, from the war on poverty to the war on crime, and trying to explain how we became a mass incarceration society and the origins of that, in this Great Society, war on poverty, war on crime moment. And a big part of that has to do with one, I mean, it exemplifies the failures of liberal social policy and the ways in which Johnson's own racist assumptions shaped what he saw as possible and feasible. So, and this goes back to people like Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who were very influential over the direction of domestic policies during the Johnson administration, that said, that recognized historical racism, that recognized some of the socioeconomic dynamics behind Black poverty, but ultimately, and this is so key, saw the root cause of Black poverty as being Black behavior. Yeah. So if the root cause of Black poverty is pathology, then Johnson and his Council of Economic Advisors said, okay, well, we can actually fight the war on poverty on the cheap. We don't really need a major structural intervention. What we need, and this is a phrase that Ramsey Clark used, who was considered one of the most liberal officials of the era, that the war on poverty should be about helping the disadvantaged, helping themselves. So instead of a job creation program, there were job training programs. Instead of really investing in robust public schools, there were remedial education programs, clinics and resources for young mothers and women to teach them how to maintain their homes. all these programs to make, in the words of Johnson and his officials, Black people into productive citizens, instead of actually giving, instead of making the fundamental systemic transformations that were necessary. So again, in the absence of, despite this, the grand title of the war on poverty and the rhetoric behind it, for many Americans of color in big cities and small cities, in the Northeast and the South and the West, fundamental conditions had not changed. And increasingly throughout the 60s, police were relied upon to manage the effects of that, the material effects of that poverty and inequality, and kind of serve as a deterrent, as policymakers strategize to prevent future, as they would say, rioting, future rebellions. So again, these racist pathological assumptions that seeped into the policies of the Johnson administration really failed to allow the kind of promise of the war on poverty to take hold and to effectively, right, give people the resources that they needed that compelled them to feel like they had no other recourse but to engage in violent protest tactics in the end.
Yeah, it's such an interesting, it's an important nuance that I think many progressives fall into the trap now, where they acknowledge that there are all of these societal forces that are leading to Black disadvantage, but then their ultimate argument is that that disadvantage has somehow damaged Black people, right? And so that, yes, it started as a structural thing, but then it has this kind of corrosive effect on Black culture, and then Black culture becomes responsible. And of course, we still often see that. I would like the people who are watching, if you have questions, you can enter them into the chat at any time, and I would love to intersperse them in the conversation with Dr. Hinton and myself, so you don't have to wait until the end. I would like to talk to you before we start moving up to more modern times. I'd like to talk to you about the slave patrols and the role of policing, and how what we started to see in the 1960s, and clearly the type of surveillance and policing that we see in Black communities today is really a legacy of the slave patrols, where policing was a form of social control. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so in many ways, law enforcement strategies that shape American life today grow out of both the strategies that were used from 1619 onwards to control and contain racially marginalized groups, indigenous groups, enslaved people, poor white people, and in particular, slave patrols kind of and the purpose and function of slave patrols kind of laid the groundwork for some of the functions that, when modern police forces really took hold, would later assume. So slave patrols were responsible for dispersing slave gatherings, identifying runaway enslaved Africans, confiscating contraband, meaning books and weapons. Again, Black people, the Second Amendment never applies to Black people who are don't enjoy or don't have access to the same Second Amendment rights as white people do. And basically, the function and logic of slave patrols was containing and exerting social control over people of color. And this, of course, is the fundamental logic of American policing in general. Even though today, it's the kind of policing itself, or the kind of inherent purpose and function of police is very different in both low-income communities of color and in middle class and wealthy white areas. So in low-income communities of color, the purpose of police is to identify criminals, arrest them, and remove them from the community to help facilitate the process of incarceration. In white and middle class communities, the purpose of policing is to protect property. And this, this deeply, deeply shapes and grounds racial inequalities, but also the kind of fundamental social divisions that have structured American society from its very foundings.
Yeah, I think like that's such an important point. And in your book, you have these amazing examples that I think will be not astounding at all to Black people, but quite astounding to white people who have just fundamentally never seen the type of policing that Black people have experienced, which is, I think, why they have such a hard time understanding Black relationships to police. So you talk about Cairo, Illinois, or Illinois, Lord, I got real Black on that one. Cairo, Illinois. And it's a place that I've studied quite a bit because of their fights over housing and the segregation in their public housing, which are actually ongoing. And it's a southern Illinois city. A lot of people, because we have so much racial amnesia in this country, don't know that southern Illinois is basically the South.
Yep.
I mean, it's not literally south of the Mason-Dixon line, but it is the South, and operated at de jure segregated for much of the history of this country until really the 1950s and 60s. So you talk about this community that's literally in a proxy war with the police. Yes. Can you talk about a bit about that story and how it fits into the larger story in the book that you're trying to tell?
Yeah, so the Cairo story is one that I weave throughout the book, but it figures really prominently in the first part, because Cairo was the site of the longest rebellion. It really, I mean, you could argue it started in 67, but the kind of height of the violence was between 69 and 72. And essentially, you know, Cairo is exceptional in many ways, but also so reflective of America as a whole, and is a kind of warning sign to all of us about the kind of power of American racism, which I'll explain in a second. So basically, you know, Cairo was by the late 1960s. As Nikole said, it's basically, you know, it's the very southernmost tip of Illinois. There's about 8,000 residents, just under half were Black. Most of the Black residents in the city lived in this housing project called Pyramid Courts, and had no political power whatsoever because of the winner-take-all voting structure. So they never were able to achieve the majority for political representation. The town, the political and economic institutions in the town were entirely run by white people. They were completely locked out of jobs. And throughout the 60s, actually, Cairo became a really important site for John Lewis in 63 to work with activists there and launch a sit-in movement. You know, there was a really robust freedom struggle, not entirely nonviolent freedom struggle that relied on lawsuits and sit-ins and protests to desegregate the town. And essentially, you know, the kind of power and racism was so pronounced in Cairo because the white political and economic establishment there was deeply, deeply entrenched with white vigilantism in general and the police force. So it was, so that kind of like like the white vigilantes, the political and economic elites, and the police force were so deeply intertwined that Black residents in Cairo basically had no recourse, to achieve any kind of basic political or economic rights, and no protection against white vigilante violence. So beginning in the late 1960s, the white vigilantes began to literally stand on the Mississippi levee, because the town borders the Mississippi River, and shoot into the all-Black housing project of Pyramid Courts every night. And eventually the residents in Pyramid Courts fought back, both by boycotting the white stores in the cities, organizing with their brothers and sisters in the Chicago Urban League and other civil rights organizations to help provide them basic food and clothing as they refused to participate in Cairo's economy, because they said, we're not gonna buy from these white store owners so that they can buy bullets to shoot at us. So when
I want you to slow this down a little, because if you're not reading the book, this story is,
it's incredible,
crazy. Even for people like, you know, myself, who like studies the like torrid racial history of this country all the time. Like, they were terrorizing this community. You talk about how families were like They didn't want to put lights on in their house at nighttime. They were afraid to let their kids go outside. Can you just talk a little bit more about that terror that was being rained down with the acquiescence of the police force on this community?
Yeah, and it's the kind of it's that, you know, in kind of researching this story, I mean, it is a haunting terror that we often think about as being kind of part of an earlier chapter of American history, you know, in the 1910s or maybe even in the 1950s, and, you know, relegated to Mississippi and Alabama. But this is Cairo, Illinois in the 1970s. And that was actually one of the things that really surprised me. I mean, because of the ways in which white power operated in the city, young Black children walking home from school were attacked by German shepherds, and their parents couldn't do anything about it. There was no, until people armed themselves in self-defense, organized, built cooperatives based on socialist principles, and basically said, okay, we've got to figure out, led by an amazing activist named Charles Cohn and the Black United Front, which was a vibrant civil rights organization in the city. You know, we're going to do this two-pronged legal assault in every way we can on the rampant discrimination within institutions in Cairo. And, you know, also, by the way, the schools there, like many other places, didn't desegregate until the late 60s. And once they did, following larger patterns, many of the parents pulled white students out, put them in private schools. So this violence, because of the ways in which this white supremacy was entwined with the political establishment and the police, lasted for a very long time. And there was a lack, you know, I mean, it's not as if there was coverage of what was happening in Cairo, which was surprising. I mean, some of that coverage, and actually, you know, the way that I encountered the city in the archive that I used for much of the book was that essentially that these Black snipers were shooting up, you know, innocent white people, and they were shooting up the police station for no reason, and it was chaos because of these militant Negroes. I mean, that was the coverage. It was not, a lot of the coverage was not, you know, look at this community that is being terrorized and oppressed, but instead focusing on, again, thinking about who has access to the Second Amendment, you know, what Black leaders in the community did to protect that community from vigilante violence. And in the end, I mean, I think this is where Cairo is really just a warning to the US. The establishment of Cairo, rather than conceding rights and political and economic power to Black residents, basically tanked Cairo's economy. They either left the city or tanked the economy. It was more important to them to hang on to white supremacy than to provide for their own children. And I think that, especially in the context of what we're seeing now, is a really, really telling warning sign about the lengths that white people will go to maintain systems of racial oppression.
Right, and that's clearly, I mean, in your hometown of Detroit, Newark, name your city, you saw that same pattern. That was that retrenchment and then withdrawal, rather than share
Exactly.
Economy, facilities, education, anything. So your book, you know, we all kind of think about those big rebellions in the 60s. And for those, you know, the Cairo story is a few years before I'm born, not too long ago, a few years probably before you're born, not too long ago. But when we hear those stories, I think those of us who didn't live through it, and I think white Americans probably in general, kind of don't realize how all across the country, it was like almost a state of war. I interviewed Walter Mondale for an investigation I did on housing segregation and failures to enforce the Fair Housing Act. And he talks about in '68, leading up to the Fair Housing Act, they literally thought the United States was on the brink of civil war. That is the only reason they get the Fair Housing Act passed. And we've just erased that from our memory. And you talk about in your book how between '68 and '72, in a 4-year period, there were nearly 2,000 uprisings in nearly 1,000 cities, which means there were multiple uprisings happening in some cities. Yep. And they weren't just in these big cities like LA or Detroit, but in places like my hometown, Waterloo, all of these little towns across the country. Talk about the extent of this how violent this period was, the extent of these uprisings, and why we've kind of purged that from our national memory of that era.
Yeah, I mean, just one comment, because I almost responded to this before when you mentioned it, but just like about kind of white denial of the violence that's been inflicted on Black people. I mean, I think that's so, like, that is, well, in some ways it answers this question, right? Because that's part of the reason why we haven't really understood this history of the 60s and 70s. I think, and even I see this in the archives that I use, like there's just been a denial. Well, one, there's this idea that like racism is really a figment of Black people's imagination,
Yeah.
that we just like everything is just overblown, and that police brutality isn't something that's real, but it's just it's something that Black people imagine or fabricate. And I think, that really began to change, or at least that I think white Americans began to recognize, okay, maybe this actually is a thing, with Rodney King in 91, when, there was this videotape beating. And I think that's one of the things that's made a big difference in recent years with, the fact that we all have these cameras in our pockets. Like now, what's been going on in our communities that Black people have known about for years and people of color have known about for years is now on display. And there's now proof that is undeniable that the American public as a whole has to reckon with. So the question, that 68 to 72 period is so important. That's what I call the crucible period. And it goes back to what I was talking about earlier about Johnson and the war on crime. So the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968 is passed in June. It's one of the last major pieces of domestic legislation Johnson enacts, and basically takes all of these experimental programs the federal government had been funding in big cities, in LA and Baltimore and in Miami and Detroit, which had facilitated the transfer of surplus military weapons from Vietnam and Latin America and the Caribbean, and also helped to expand and professionalize police forces and train them in riot control techniques, all these things that had been happening in the largest American cities where rebellion might have taken an even larger hit to political and economic institutions, started to flow through this new federal grant program, this unprecedented federal intervention in local law enforcement to smaller and mid-sized towns, to rural communities, to places like Cairo and places like York, Pennsylvania, and places like Albuquerque, New Mexico, and Carver Ranchers, Florida. All of these smaller communities now had expanded police forces, now had, M4 carbine rifles and bulletproof vests and tear gas and the weapons of the war on crime. And when these expanded militarized forces came into segregated low-income Black communities, residents responded as they had in Harlem and Watts, and they rebelled. And so I think this is like the real key thing that historians miss, because we had there were several hundred rebellions from 64 to 68. But after the Safe Streets Act, once this new war on crime is really, really hitting in cities big and small throughout the United States, that's actually when rebellion peaked. It didn't, like the Martin Luther King Jr. rebellions following the assassination were not the last hurrah. They were only the beginning of what would come as the war on crime unfolded. And I think in terms of the history of the freedom struggle, and the way that we understand how communities respond to the expansion of policing of their ordinary and everyday lives, this history, the fact that so many people responded to police violence with violence, tells us a lot about dynamics between police and communities, how we got to where we are, and also expands, again, the kind of boundaries of what we think of as Black protests. Because, the rebellions were, in this later period, the most widely adopted form of protest among young Black people. And I think, that chapter of the freedom struggle has been left out, and is, I think, important in terms of understanding the longer histories of the protest movement for racial justice that continues today.
Can you talk a little bit more? I thought this was a fascinating part of your book, and also really critical for understanding what we've seen in terms of police response to Black Lives Matter protests and other uprisings is, and and this is why studying history, right, is so important, because you look at what happens in, if you've only ever remembered police coming out with tanks and military grade equipment and using tear gas, then you just think that's the way it's always been. And you don't realize that, no, policing didn't have to be like that. It wasn't always like that. So talk about how at the end of the Vietnam War, Korean War, the Vietnam War, we have all this surplus military equipment. And it's actually kind of astounding that the response of the government is, let's give this. So when they call it the war on crime, it's literally a war. They're using war tools, war gear. Can you talk about why the government thinks that this is what they should do with that excess equipment, and how that transforms the relationship that police have to these communities? I mean, if you treat police like they're soldiers in gear for enemy combat, they treat the communities they're policing like enemies, right?
Exactly. That's a really good point. It ends up becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think one way to think about this, and one way to think about the kind of period of rebellion and the enduring implications is as an era of insurgency and counterinsurgency. I mean, Black people have historically been an insurgent force. The threat of Black rebellion has always kind of haunted white political and economic elites from 16.
It's in the Declaration of Independence, right?
Exactly. And so, and policymakers in the 60s recognized that and saw rebellion as a threat. And one of the big things I argue in the book is that, the declaration of the war on crime itself was in response to the demographic changes wrought by the Great Migration, the fact that cities were becoming Blacker and that there was a growing population of Black youth that policymakers weren't providing jobs and robust opportunities for. And they said, beginning in the Kennedy administration, started calling Black youth social dynamite, because I said, if we don't do something, they're gonna explode. And so I think, this insurgency, counterinsurgency extends both to, what was going on in the streets of American cities, but also what's going on in Vietnam. And in many ways, we can think about it as being kind of part of a larger continuum of intervention and occupation in, as many Black radicals talked about in the time, in occupied territory, in a colonized community. I mean, there was, lots of, in the era of rebellion, I mean, many Black theorists understood the kind of conditions of the community as being part of an internal colony. And in many ways, with the deployment of this war, and I think, Nikole, I'm so glad that you said that, because it wasn't just like the war on poverty might have been a metaphor, but the war on crimes and drugs are actually, like, they are real wars on people of color. And with that also ties to the kind of larger military and then prison industrial complex, where it's lucrative for these companies to be making these weapons and technologies that can be used both overseas, but also against domestic insurgents at home.
Yes, it made me think about this idea of the internal enemy, which we see around the War of 1812, where Black folks are like, whoever's going to get us free, that's the side we're fighting on. And the white Americans were understanding that there was an enemy within that they couldn't trust, because they were trying to fight for their freedom, which makes me talk about why, when we see colonized communities in other countries, when we see communities in other countries, though clearly not in Israel, but in other places, kind of rising up and taking whatever they can, throwing stones, we understand that these are political acts, right? We understand that these are oppressed people who are responding to their circumstance, but we do not translate that to Black Americans. And in fact, we just act like they're a bunch of people who just unorganized, no thought, animalistic, operating on instinct, and just want to, loot and tear up things. Talk about why we are unable to actually see and recognize the political actions, and that Black people are asserting agency in this moment. Why can't we talk about it in that way?
Yeah, I mean, it gets to the heart of the kind of the ways in which white supremacy structures the narratives that we tell ourselves, and the ways in which racism truly pervades our society. I mean, we think, we saw this throughout the 20th century when the US is fighting for democracy abroad and denying equal rights to Black people and other racially marginalized groups at home. And really, some have argued that in the context of this kind of Cold War PR needs, this is part of the reason why we ended up getting civil rights legislation, because the US could no longer begin to be pretend to be like the arbiter of democracy while maintaining apartheid at home. I mean, I think, this too has to do with one, just how dehumanized in general Black people are, how Black protests or protests for racial justice in general historically has been criminalized. I mean, I look a lot in the book and the book focuses on violent political rebellion, but as soon as Black people started in the 50s, started marching in the streets and filing lawsuits and demanding equal rights, conservatives immediately said this is criminal. I mean, we saw it last summer. We saw it last summer when nonviolent protests chanting Black Lives Matter, demanding racial justice, are still called criminal and violent, even when they're peaceful. So it is this double standard of the kind of protests that is acceptable for Black people to embrace. And again, the fact that any call for racial justice, because of the threat it represents to the status quo in American institutions, is immediately, by at least some swaths of the population, treated as something that's criminal. So I think it relates to that.
Yeah, it's in the last year with the pandemic, we've seen some white Americans asserting that having to wear a mask was a violation of their rights, right? But Black people are just supposed to submit to police, let them stop you, let them search you, comply. That expectation does not hold for white Americans. And I think I'd love for you to talk about just the different expectations of rights that we have for Black folks when police, I mean, in my neighborhood, they'll just put up a surveillance tower. You literally don't, it's a watchtower in the middle of the neighborhood, and you have no idea why it's there. And you cannot fathom this happening in white communities. And just knowing that the police are watching you, the sense all the time that you are being watched and surveilled, but that you also should just comply. It's much like you saying Black people don't have Second Amendment rights. It seems like there are other rights that we are not expected to be able to assert as well.
Yeah, and I mean, I think just exactly what you're saying, the way that Black people and that Black spaces are policed and surveilled. And this is something that, again, I mean, this ties to the kind of the mass community responses to the early deployment of these tactics during the war on crime that led to that crucible era of rebellion, when, like a group of teenagers hanging out in a park get arrested for trespassing. That would never happen if a group of white teenagers were hanging out, I don't know, in front of a roller skating rink in the suburbs, something like that, right? A party or a family barbecue getting broken up. Again, because when Black people gather, and this goes back to the slave patrol comment and the history of slave patrols, gatherings of Black people are always a threat.
Suspicious.
Yeah, again, like in part because of the threat of rebellion, and part of because the threat of insurgency. And therefore can be policed, and therefore the police officer, in searching for, assuming that there is criminal activity going on because of assumptions about Blackness and criminality, because of the links between Blackness and criminality in the American imagination, ends up being able to use state power to police and to circumvent even instances of Black joy. We know this doesn't happen in suburban communities. I mean, we think about Dante Wright, who was pulled over for not having an air freshener on his rearview mirror. That would never happen in a white suburb of Minneapolis. That would never happen. That would never happen there. And then,
well, not to a white person in a white suburb, but it would happen us in a white suburb.
Right. That's what I meant. So again, so much of what, the aggressive enforcement of misdemeanors, which has been what has propelled these wars in low-income communities of color and mass incarceration, you know, is not part of one's life and existence in white communities and in many middle-class communities as well.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's also a legacy of slavery when during the period of Reconstruction, right, white people criminalized normal behaviors in order to be able to arrest Black people and force them to work on plantations. We don't.
Just on that real quick, I mean, that's
Mhm.
that is the tendency. That is like the one, you know, like one of the big historical trends that we see, like every time rights, the bounds of citizenship and rights expand for oppressed groups and for Black Americans, we get new criminal laws, we get a clampdown, we get a mass incarceration. It happened after the Civil War in 1865, and then it happened a century later in 1965 when Johnson called the war on crime.
So what I love about this book is I don't know if this is a word, I'm going to make it into a word, depathologizes these rebellions, right? And actually says these rebellions are a very natural response to the circumstances that Black people are living in, because there is no expectation that you can go to the police for help, or you can go to the county commission or the mayor for help, that the systems, they're the ones sending the police into your neighborhoods to do these things to you, and you are not going to be able to actually go through the quote unquote proper channels, right? So talk about what is this book, because I said I was going to give more time for Q&A, but I'm just so enjoying this conversation with you. Talk about what the book offers for instruction in terms of understanding what we saw in 2020 and the path forward.
So, I mean, I think so there are a lot of moments where I try to emphasize where there are missed opportunities, or where there were alternatives presented to both federal, state, and local officials that weren't pursued. And I think one of the first big ones is the Kerner Commission. The Kerner Commission, you know, Johnson calls the Kerner Commission in the middle of the Detroit Rebellion of '67 to investigate the causes of all the rebellions that had rocked American cities during his presidency. And when the Kerner Commission produced its best-selling report, Johnson didn't really like what they had to say. They said, look, if we want to, you know, if we want to address riots, as they called them, we got to go far beyond the war on poverty for all the reasons I mentioned earlier. You know, the kind of the lack of a big structural intervention. The Kerner Commission said we essentially need a Marshall Plan for American cities. We have to invest in these communities. People are rebelling because they want jobs. People are rebelling because they want educational opportunities. We have to provide people with decent housing. This is going to take a massive mobilization of both the public and private sector, and we got to start investing in these communities. And instead of making those investments into robust social institutions and welfare programs and meeting people's basic needs, that investment went into police and surveillance and incarceration time and time again. I mean, even, you know, in Cairo, a commission came in '72, just as the violence had subsided, to investigate what had happened. The Federal Civil Rights Commission, and identified many of the socioeconomic drivers of the violence, and also, you know, called out the deep alliance between the white power structure and white vigilante groups, and said, first and foremost, the police department has to admonish white supremacist groups and make clear that they're not entangled with them, which later the police department continued to refuse to do. Wouldn't even make a statement saying, you know, there are no vigilantes here. But time and time again, the socioeconomic causes that many people drew attention to as a way to prevent rebellion in the future were consistently ignored. And so I think one of the big, and the consequences of divesting from social welfare programs and investing instead in policing and incarceration in low-income communities has brought us to the point where we are today. And so I think, you know, we're at this crossroads where the kind of the punitive policies of the immediate post-civil rights period have not worked. They've exacerbated inequality in many communities. They have not kept, they have not effectively dealt with the problem of gun violence and crime in some of the most vulnerable communities in this country. And so now it's time to do what many communities are calling for and what the people want, and that is investing a different set of resources into communities and empowering community organizations to address public safety concerns and needs on their own terms. I mean, that is what we need going forward. Police reform, another point I make in the book, is not going to get us out of this. It hasn't gone far enough. We got to go back to what the Kerner Commission said more than 15 years ago. We need a massive set of new investments and a structural transformation.
Yeah, it also said that white people were implicated in the ghetto. They created it, they sustained it, and it's their obligation to undo it. I remember the first time I read the Kerner Commission report, I was like, damn, they were not playing around. You can't even imagine a report like that coming out today. So I'm gonna go to we only have a few minutes left, some of the questions from the Q&A. Thank you everyone for hanging in with us as I kind of nerded out with Dr. Hinton. So Kelly wants to know, how difficult was it to research this book? What was the most challenging about your research, and what methods did you use?
So, in many ways, this book was the sources that I used for this book, the access that I gained was kind of a stroke of luck. And I wonder if in some ways we, because the archive that I used was private for so long, if this is part of the reason why we didn't know this history. I mean, I think, in some ways, it's so key to be transparent, to open up records as much as we can. But what I used for that late 60s crucible period and all of the kind of quantitative measure of rebellions, the timeline that's included, the 25-page timeline of Black rebellions in the back of the book, comes from the records of the Lemberg Center for the Study of Violence, which formed right after John F. Kennedy was assassinated and was housed at Brandeis, and the researchers at the Lemberg Center basically wanted to understand American violence, and not just Black rebellions, but the labor struggles and the anti-war protests and the student movement that characterized the 60s and early 70s. And they did quantitative studies and interviewed people, and most importantly, for my purposes, collected tens of thousands of newspaper clippings from local newspapers depicting violence in American communities. And I happened to, as I mentioned, I knew that rebellion persisted, but it was into the 70s, but it was difficult to actually figure out what was going on there. And I was in a conversation, I was introduced at actually a barbecue with a colleague of mine. I met Christian Davenport, who's a political scientist at the University of Michigan and runs the Radical Information Project there. And he started talking about the rebellions. He was actually getting ready to do a 50th anniversary commemoration program for the Detroit Rebellion in '67. This was in 2016. No, I'm being long-winded. I'm trying to wrap this up.
It's okay.
I'm so excited. So he said, okay, I have this archive. He just had the Lemberg records in his possession. He said, I have this archive, come to my office and check out these newspaper clippings. And so I went there, and then I was like, oh, I just couldn't believe, these boxes full of newspaper articles of this history that we had completely overlooked, and all of these stories, all of these rich textures of these struggles that were just incredibly compelling. And the archive had been kind of like passed around among this group of political scientists. And so that's why it hadn't been public. I think parts of the archive are now back at Brandeis. And I know that Christian, through the Radical Information Project, is hoping to digitize much of the archive. But so that was kind of a starting point between the newspaper clippings, archival sources, various archival sources that I could get my hands on, oral history interviews, and secondary sources, especially in the later period. Some secondary works in particular were super helpful. That's how I was able to put the many stories, but still only scratching the surface, that I told in the book all together.
So I'm going to go Stephanie Jones Rogers, another amazing academic and historian. Her book, They Were Her Property, is transformative. Y'all should also pick that up. So she has a question, and she wants to know, can you speak to how gender shaped the story you tell and the events you examine in America on Fire?
So that's such an important question. You know, I think one of the kind of central actors, at least in the Crucible period, were young kids. I mean, most of the people who were involved were young people, many of high school age, but some as young as 10 and 12 years old, young boys and girls who fought back against police together. I think in many of the stories, though, the kind of actors who are at the center of precipitating incidents are often women. So when women are brutalized by police, for instance, in Peoria, Illinois, a 16-year-old pregnant young woman was pushed to the ground by a police officer. And after this happened, you know, many of her friends, other young teenagers, stepped in to defend her. And this ended up resulting in a rebellion that lasted for several days. A young woman, a young mother who was evicted from a housing project in Peoria a few years later, as she was being evicted by the police, residents came to her defense, moved, you know, back the baby crib back into the apartment, and the police came back, and this ended up resulting in a major rebellion where residents of the housing project burned down many of the administrative offices in the housing project. So, you know, women were both active and central participants in the rebellions, but also I think because of the gender violence that Black women in particular experienced when police or state actors were seen inflicting violence against women, the community was very quick to come again to their defense, to her defense. Part of the kind of shift in or the need to protect Black women and the community when there was no other recourse for protection, when a 16-year-old, again, talking about differential policing, a young pregnant white woman would never get pushed down on the ground by a police officer. This just wouldn't happen. But a young pregnant Black women do and did. And that extreme violence in itself
Yes.
would ignite something much larger.
Thank you. Yeah, that story, particularly about the community's response to the eviction, it was just, you know, it was a beautiful story of community, right? Of people. And again, I think speaks to agency, which is so often stripped of these stories. Like they knew which entity was oppressing them, and they went to destroy that particular entity, and moving the woman back in and saying, no, you're not going to make our community member homeless.
Right.
I just love how you're subverting with this text how we're thinking about these acts of rebellion. We have 2 minutes, so I'm going to ask one more question.
This
is from Vanessa. No, you're not. I mean, you know a lot, and we want to hear it. So Vanessa Diaz says, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the significance of the murder of George Floyd being legally deemed a murder. Since police murders of Black people are rarely deemed murder, I understand there's a tension between the critique of policing and conceptualizations of legality as a whole, but this still seems like a very significant legal moment.
Hi, Vanessa. Thanks so much for that question. You know, one thing that was really one of my many reactions to the George Floyd verdict is like, okay, we can actually call this a murder. I mean,
a
through
murder.
the book,
that's right.
I had to, you know, the book was vetted and fact checked, and you know, several lawyers read it, and I could not use the word murder to describe any of the police killings. And now, because the rare moment that Derek Chauvin actually was convicted for murdering George Floyd, we can call it a murder. And I think, again, this goes to questions that we've been talking about throughout the discussion about like who holds power, who holds what kind of violence is legitimate, and how we view and respond to the kind of reality of state-sanctioned killings against people of color. I mean, for so long, again, as we talked about earlier, these incidents are seen as kind of like a figment of our imagination or overblown, when in fact these murders have defined Black American life in the United States historically. And again, until we get beyond these categories of what kind of violence is legitimate, who has access to resources, and the kind of narrowed response that is only, again, going back to that earlier question about terminology, that can only be solved by more police. We're going to continue to see these killings. We're going to continue to be stuck here, and we're going to continue to live in a country where these injustices are experienced every day. I mean, just earlier this week with Andrew Brown Jr., this is just part of life. And yeah, you might get a small victory to a certain extent, where you get a basic conviction for somebody who slowly murdered another person on camera for 9 minutes, but this is not justice, and we still have such a long way to go.
Yes. Well, I could talk to you for another hour, but it's 9 o'clock on a Friday. I'm drinking my bourbon. Y'all can feel free to join me. Please get this book. It's just so informative, and also you're a really great writer. So it's a pleasure to read, and you'll just learn so much. So thank you for writing the book, and I really appreciate you asking me to be in conversation with you today.
Thank you so much, Nikole. It was my true honor. As I said on Twitter earlier today, you are one of my biggest heroes and national treasures. So thank you so much for your brilliance, your wisdom, all the work that you're doing. I can't wait to see where you go next, and and for the 1619 project to be out in November.
Thank you. Me too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ladies. But I do have one final question, and feel free to answer this, both of you. We always ask our guests here at Politics and Prose, what, if anything, you're reading right now, and if you could share that with our viewing audience.
I'll go first so you can go last. I'm actually reading My Face is Black is True by Mary Frances Berry, which is about the efforts of a woman named Callie House to get pension and reparations for enslaved people right after the end of slavery. And then for a little bit of pleasure, I'm reading Caitlin Greenridge's Liberté, which is her new novel.
Nice. I'm reading On Juneteenth by my former colleague, Annette Gordon-Reed, which just came out earlier this month. And Annette just does such a brilliant job weaving in. I mean, it's like something to think about, that I'd love to be able to write like this down the road, but she weaves in family history and memoir to tell the story of Black freedom in Texas, and the ways in which Black people deeply shape culture and life and politics in Texas for centuries. And it's such a just beautiful example of how to just make history personal, and shows us why history is actually deeply personal for each and every one of us.
Excellent. She will be joining us here at PNP this coming week to discuss on Juneteenth. So
there you go.
Take us out with that. On behalf of Politics and Prose, I'd like to thank both of you for this wonderful discussion. And of course, I'd like to thank everyone who has tuned in. Thank you all. Don't forget to go purchase several copies from the link in the chat section. And everyone out there, please stay safe, stay well read. Hope you all have a good evening.
Bye, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Nikole.